Now that I have my level open, I'm going to want to go to FlowGraph, and I want to open my main and find my initial setup section. And what I want to do is actually display this UI element on game start. So we're going to come down to the UI folder here, where you're going to see quite a bit of stuff, and we're looking for display and the display node. And go ahead and drag that onto there. I'm going to connect the output of my game start to the show input of my UI display node. And then I need to actually connect it to the element through that XML script. So I double click on element, click on this browse button, and you should see your UI Flappy score here. If you don't, there is a bug or a problem or some kind of misstep in your XML script or in your Flash file. And that's happened to me plenty of times because it's, like I said, very unforgiving. So just debug that script very carefully. We've displayed it. Right now, I actually left that message score :000 in there. Probably should have left it blank. Isn't going to do any harm though as long as I finish the job here, which is to go to our scoring section. And I'm just going to review what we had done here. On game start, it immediately sets the value of our int score game token to 0. It combines that with the word score and the colon, and it passes that on to this display message thing. So all of that functionality happens from the beginning of the game, and every time we score by touching one of these score triggers over here, this goes into a logic any, and if any one of them are touched, it increments the score by adding 1 to it. That also gets passed on to this same function and updates the message. So all I need to do is get rid of this. You could also just disable it like I've done here. I'm going to actually get rid of it. And now we need to actually put our UI function in here. So that's going to be under UI functions. And you should see UI Flappy score, which is your GFX file, and your function name under there, which is update score. Again, if you don't see this stuff, that's because there's either a bug or you left CRYENGINE running while you created this stuff. So try restarting first. So I'm going to drag my function onto here. It's very simple. There's our one parameter, text, which was created in the XML script. And I'm just going to map the out of this string concatenator into both the call to display it and to populate the actual content, the text of it. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and save and test. Oh, by the way, I've been meaning to point out something. I don't know if you can tell, but there's something that looks weird about my view, my camera. If you scroll back, you may see this, or if you have one of those saved views, I have Control F1, which is supposed to show me all 8 pipes. This is what it looks like. And CRYENGINE has an odd habit. If you've ever tweaked this field of view in the editor, it seems to want to always go back to that rather than the default. So just go back to your perspective viewport's camera menu, the field of view menu, and go back to 60 or whatever you want to use. Our camera view FlowGraph node has its own field of view setting that will change it during gameplay anyway. Let's test, and there's our score 0, and each time we hit a star, it increments. By the way, I've got the sounds that we created in the last chapter muted for now, just so it's not distracting. Now let's create a main menu for our game that appears when the game is first launched, says welcome to Flappy or something like that, and simply prompts the player to choose their difficulty level. And I'm going to use 4 different difficulty levels from newbie to ninja. So I'm back in Flash again. I'm going to start as I did before by making a new file. I'm going to make it full HD in size, 30 frames per second. Make sure you're working in pixels. Make sure you're on ActionScript 2. Check my publish settings. Get those set up before I forget. Turn off HTML. Under my Flash settings, I need to set Flash Player 10 and ActionScript 2. And I need to tell it to put it in the right place. So again, I'm going to go back and reveal the location of my game. Come under Game SDK, Libs, UI, Flash Assets is where I'm going to keep mine. I'm going to right click here and copy this address as text. Come back to Flash. Click on the little browse button, paste that path in there, and then add the actual file name. And we should be good to go. Go ahead and save. And again, I'm going to put it in that same Flash Assets folder. First thing I'm going to do is just fill the background with a solid color. I'm not going to use white. I'm going to name my layer BG for background. I'm going to use my rectangle tool here. I don't want any stroke color. And I'm just going to pick some kind of dark background color. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that layer and make a new one. I'm going to call this static text. This is just going to be my text that doesn't change, like welcome to Flappy, something like that. It does not need to be dynamic text. It can just be static. I'm going to use good old white. I'm not trying to do anything fancy here. I'm going to make it center aligned, much bigger. I don't know, maybe I'll do some kind of yellow here. Not so great with the purple, but that's all right. And then I want to just make it clear to the user what they're supposed to do. And that's it for my static text. I'm going to lock that layer so I can't accidentally select it. And make a new layer where I'm going to put my menu text. And I'll make these dynamic colors when the mouse rolls over them. I don't think I can live with that background color, so I'm going to change it. Better. Okay, this I do want to be dynamic because I'm going to change its color on the fly. And what I'm going to do is sample my background color and then come back to here and just make it a slightly brighter version so it sort of pops out, but I still have room to go for an even brighter version, let's say on rollover. And I'm going to go for left aligned on these. And you could just say newbie or beginner or level 1, level 2. I'm going to be cute and choose some bird names. Maybe I need those to be a bit brighter. And I'm going to name this text level 1. And then I'm going to duplicate it. I'm not going to use the duplicate command because it ends up putting it in some random position. I'm going to use copy and paste into place because it ends up exactly on top of it. Kind of like the same reason I don't use duplicate in the CRYENGINE editor so much. I don't want these to overlap so that I don't have issues with the mouse rollovers. I'm going to actually copy and paste the height so these are exactly the same. I'm going to call this one text level 2. I'm going to copy both of these, paste in place, move them down. I'm not worrying about exact positioning right now. You could knock yourself out. And name these TXT level 3 and TXT level 4, or if you want to use words like beginner, advanced, intermediate, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Now, there are lots of ways to approach this. I'm going to use a separate layer for button objects, which are completely transparent, which coincide with the shape and size of my text objects. So I can control the text objects independently from sensing the button rollovers. So I'm going to make my alpha 0, lock my menu text layer, and I accidentally made a folder instead of a layer. Just want to be careful that these aren't bigger than they need to be so they don't have any chance of them overlapping. And then I don't want to leave it this editable object. I want to turn it into a symbol. So I'm going to right click on it and say convert to symbol. And I'm going to name this button level 1 and I'm going to make it a movie clip. Same thing, copy, paste into place, and just make 4 more of them. Doesn't really matter about this. If you really want to be fussy, you can resize it. Copy and paste 2 more. So there are my 4 buttons. Next, I want to go ahead and create my ActionScript. I'm going to put that on its own layer. And in that first frame, the first thing I want to do is stop the timeline from actually proceeding past frame 1, because I'm not using animation or time in here. And again, there are a lot of different ways to do these rollover colors. But before we even get to that, what I want to do is declare a function for actually responding to clicking on these, and that's going to be to convey the choice of difficulty here in the Flash object over to FlowGraph. So set difficulty is what I'm going to call my function. Function is what it is, and I'm going to have one argument called difficulty, and the data type is going to be number. Then inside my curly braces, this is the key part to this whole thing. This fs command is what communicates between Flash and CRYENGINE. So I need to match this very carefully, including the name of the argument. Now we're actually going to deal with the rollover colors when the mouse comes over these text objects. I'm going to add a comment just to remind myself where I am. Declare a variable of type color. Refer to my first button under the fledgling word there. And on the rollover event, run this function. And then what I'm actually going to do to it is take my variable and assign some kind of lighter color. So in order to figure out what this is, I'm going to go check this color and actually copy the color value in HTML there. And I can go back and lock that layer again. Go back to my ActionScript. And then the format for this set RGB is a little bit funny. It's not the pound sign like an HTML color. It reads like this. And I need to create a brighter version of this. So all these numbers basically need to get larger on the hexadecimal scale. That takes care of the rollover. And then I want to do when I roll back out, I need to restore it back to the original color. I still have that original color on the clipboard. And then finally, even though we'll probably never see it, I'm going to define a color for when the text object is actually clicked on, or the button is clicked on, and then triggers the change of text color. And for this, I'm just going to use white. But the key thing that I need to do here, once this button is clicked, is to actually run my set difficulty function and pass it a particular value. So what I've decided to do is simply use integers 1, 2, 3, and 4 to represent my 4 levels from easiest to hardest. So I'm going to trigger passing the value 1 through my set difficulty function when this first button is clicked. And I'll go back and proofread, find my typos, and I can go ahead and test this by running a publish preview. And you can see that when I roll over it, it gets brighter. And if I hold down the left mouse button, that triggers the clicked, and I get the white. Okay, now that we know this works, we're just going to copy this 3 more times for the second, third, and fourth buttons. Basically change all the 1s to 2s. And don't forget the most important one. You now want to pass a different difficulty level for this particular button. Last test. Try the clicking. The only thing I don't like is I think I made my text too bright to begin with, or the rollover text is too close to white. But like I said, I don't ever think we're going to really see that white, because as soon as we click, what we're going to do is hide this menu and start the game. Okay, so now that we have this, I want to simplify this down to its essence. What I'm going to do is remove everything except the essentials here. Changing the color on rollover and on click and on rollout is simply decorative. What counts here is simply that we've defined a function to communicate the user's choice of difficulty level back to CRYENGINE. So to be perfectly clear, what we did with the score was communicate from FlowGraph to Flash. Specifically, what we did was use a FlowGraph UI function node to send an integer value back to Flash through fs command. What we're doing here is just the opposite, or I should say we're using the same technique, the fs command, in a defined function called setDifficulty, but in the opposite direction. So very simply, all that's happening is we have 4 buttons, and each time one of those buttons is clicked, it calls our function called setDifficulty and passes this one parameter, difficulty, which is simply an integer, and sends it back to FlowGraph. So the communication is in the opposite direction. It's from Flash to FlowGraph. And I'm telling you this because when we get to the XML script in the next step, what we're going to do is define this as an event, not as a function, even though it says function here in Flash. And I know that's a bit confusing. It's just important for you to look at which way is the communication happening. It'll become more clear when you look at the actual UI node in FlowGraph, because rather than getting called, it waits. And when it gets triggered from Flash to FlowGraph, it sends a signal to an output port, as well as our particular argument, which is difficulty. I hope that makes sense for now. If you're a little bit confused right now, don't worry. I think it'll become clear once we get back into FlowGraph. let's go ahead and save our file and publish it. And this is why I double check these things, because I see I actually wanted to put the word start in here. I wanted to call this UI Flappy Start Menu. And I'm also trying to be consistent with the book that's already been published. And I'll go ahead and publish. And we're done with Flash. And we should see our UI Flappy Start Menu, .swf. I'm going to compile that to a GFX by dragging it onto here. There's our GFX file, and then I'm going to cut and paste and move it to the UI folder. And now we're ready to build our XML script. Okay, so now that we have our level open, you need to open your main flow graph. And if you can find this section where we set up our difficulty, we're going to feed that in a different way now. Instead of having this hard-coded number for difficulty, which I'm going to go ahead and erase, we want to feed this from our Flash menu. So I'm going to release this trigger mapping right here. And the first thing that we want to do is actually configure our UI menu. We're going to find that under Display, Config. And these are the same options that I pointed out in the XML file. Here we can override whatever the XML file has with these settings right here in FlowGraph. So there are two settings that are going to be critical because of the design of our menu. Our menu needs to display, and we need to wait for it. And it also needs to receive mouse events, and we need to be able to see the cursor on top of it. Well, by default, the cursor is invisible, and the UI element doesn't receive mouse events. So we want to change both of those things, like this. We're going to go ahead and set these settings on Game Start. And once they're set, then we need to actually display our UI element. So onSet is going to trigger showing the actual menu. And then the next thing is we need to wait until we know that one of the menu items has been clicked. And we know that happens because the set difficulty event gets triggered. So now we go to this section called Events, and you see your UI Flappy Start menu and your one function called Set Difficulty. And like I tried to explain earlier, this is not something that I trigger from the CRYENGINE side. This is something I'm waiting on to happen from the Flash side. And specifically what I'm waiting for is this onEvent. So that means that the set difficulty function has been called from the Flash side. And when that happens, what I want to do is go ahead and hide my menu. And I want to go ahead and set my difficulty with the value that was chosen in Flash. Now there's one other tricky thing about this which is not immediately obvious until you go to test it, which is that we have to get the game to freeze and wait for the user to make a choice from this menu. Because our game starts immediately with gravity affecting Flappy and it falling and dying, we have to force all of that to stop and wait until this event has been triggered. There's a simple way to do that, and that's simply to change the time scale, which is a CVAR. So on Game Start, I'm going to set my time scale to 0. The variable is called t_scale, and the default value is 100%, normal speed. I'm going to set it to 0, which effectively stops everything. So I'll set that at the same time I'm configuring the menu and getting that to display. And then the other tricky thing is, of course, we need to remember to restore that to normal speed when this menu has been hidden. I think that's pretty much it. I can clean this up a little bit and straighten it out. See if I missed anything. So again, on Game Start, freeze time so the game itself doesn't play, set the options for the menu to receive mouse events and show the cursor, show the actual menu, and when the set difficulty function is called from Flash, go ahead and hide the menu, restore the game speed to normal, set our game token, which is a difficulty, and pass the actual difficulty value. Let's see if it works. So there's our menu. Here are our rollovers. And let's try something we know we've never seen before. Since we know we had this level of difficulty hard-coded in, let's see what the Ninja level looks like. And we're off and running. The next thing we want to do in terms of a user interface is give the user the ability to save their high score permanently. And for this, we can't use game tokens because game tokens only work when there's electricity. We need to save those scores to a file on the disk drive. And for this, we need to write and read from XML files. And this is pretty simple, really. If we go to our flow graph nodes here, you'll see that there's a whole group of nodes just to deal with XML files. And probably the best way for me to introduce this is to show you the file that we're going to end up creating, which is going to look like this. So the first thing is that every XML file has to have some kind of title for itself. And if you've ever looked inside an HTML file, you'll see this at the beginning and that at the end. So XML is very much the same kind of thing. What this says by default is simply the word root. I'm just going to replace it with the word high scores because in the future you may decide to add other sections to this XML file. So I'm going to name this particular section high scores because that's all it's going to contain. And since I've named my 4 levels, fledgling, starling, cardinal, and hawk, from easiest to hardest, what I'm going to name these children is fledgling score, starling score, etc., as you see here. So when we open the XML, we have to give it this section name. And the next thing we have to do is say create or get child. And that's this thing right here. So we're going to have 4 children, fledgling score, etc. And then the last thing is we, of course, have to read and write this value. And that's called get value, etc. And that's pretty much all there is to our XML file.